What happens when a Hollywood icon decides she's had enough of being talked over and fires back at one of daytime television's most outspoken hosts? What followed was one of the most shocking verbal clashes in The View's history, a moment so intense it left the entire studio frozen. By the end of it, Joy Behar looked like she wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. It started like any ordinary Tuesday morning on The View. The cameras swept across a buzzing studio, the audience settled into their seats, and the hosts gathered at the table. Their guest for the day? The legendary Jane Fonda. At 86, Fonda had lived several lifetimes worth of fame. Rising starlet, Oscar winner, activist, fitness icon. She was there to discuss her newest project, but no one knew that Joy Behar was about to hijack the segment and turn it into a personal battlefield. When Fonda walked onto the set, the audience erupted in warm applause. Dressed in a crisp white blazer, her silver hair styled to perfection, she carried herself with the ease of someone who had spent over 6 decades in front of cameras. She settled into her seat with graceful composure. "Welcome back to The View, Jane," Whoopi Goldberg said warmly. "It's always a pleasure to have you." "Thank you for having me," Jane replied with a gentle smile. "It's wonderful to be back." But before she could get comfortable, Joy Behar leaned forward, her tone sharp and eager. "So, Jane, I have to ask you about something that's been bothering me." A quiet tension fell instantly. "You've been very vocal about climate change and activism," Joy continued, "but don't you think it's a bit hypocritical for someone who's spent decades flying in private jets and living in massive mansions?" The question dropped like a grenade. The other hosts exchanged uneasy looks, clearly taken aback by Joy's aggressive opening. Jane's expression tightened just slightly, though her posture remained poised. "Well, Joy, that's certainly an interesting way to start an interview. I've been transparent about my past and the changes I've made. I've reduced my carbon footprint significantly, and I use my platform to raise awareness." But Joy wasn't letting go. She leaned in further, voice rising. "But come on, Jane, you can't just say you've changed and expect people to ignore your lavish lifestyle. You're telling regular folks to sacrifice while you live in luxury. Don't you see the problem?" The audience murmured. The temperature on set dropped another degree. Jane's eyes narrowed slightly, that unmistakable fire returning, the same strength that had driven her activism and defined her career. "Joy, I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here. Are you interviewing me about my current work, or are you trying to manufacture drama for your show? Because if it's the latter, you're going about it the wrong way." Joy's cheeks flushed. She had clearly not expected Jane to push back. "I'm asking the questions people want answers to. I'm being honest." "No, Joy," Jane cut in, her voice gathering force. "You're being rude and confrontational. There's a difference between honest journalism and what you're doing right now." The table fell silent. Sunny Hostin looked like she might jump in at any moment, while Sarah Haynes fidgeted nervously with the papers in front of her. Whoopi's expression was unreadable, but her shoulders tensed, as if she were preparing to intervene. Feeling cornered, Joy doubled down. "I'm sorry if you can't handle tough questions, Jane, but this is The View. We don't do softball interviews." That was the spark that lit the fuse. Jane sat up straighter, eyes blazing with controlled fury. "Tough questions?" she repeated, her voice now sharp enough to cut through the studio air. "Joy, you call that journalism? You ambushed me with poorly researched accusations without giving me a chance to properly respond." And in that moment, the entire room knew Jane Fonda had taken control, and Joy Behar was completely outmatched.
"That's not tough journalism," Jane Fonda said, her voice slicing through the studio air. "That's tabloid sensationalism." Joy Behar opened her mouth to fire back, but Jane lifted a hand. She wasn't finished. And furthermore, she continued, her tone calm but razor-sharp, if you had done even the most basic research before this interview, you'd know that I've been living in a smaller home for years. I stopped using private jets in my personal life a long time ago. I've donated millions to environmental causes, but you didn't bother to check any of that, did you? The audience was silent. So silent that even the cameras seemed to hum louder. Joy stared, caught off guard by the ferocity of Jane's response. She wasn't used to her guests pushing back this hard, and certainly not Hollywood royalty. I think our viewers deserve to know about these contradictions, Joy tried to say, though her tremble in her voice betrayed her. Her earlier confidence had evaporated. Jane leaned back in her chair, a faint smile curling at the edges of her lips. What our viewers deserve, Joy, is honest, respectful dialogue, not whatever this performance is supposed to be. The word performance hit Joy like a slap. Her face paled, then flushed, her eyes darting to the other co-hosts as if begging them to step in, but they avoided her gaze. Sunny Hostin stared at the table. Sarah Haynes had suddenly become fascinated with her note cards. Even Whoopi Goldberg remained silent, though her posture made it clear she was ready to intervene if the explosion grew worse. I don't know what you're implying, Joy said defensively, her voice cracking upward in pitch. I'm not implying anything, Jane replied coolly. I'm stating it. You're performing right now, trying to manufacture conflict where none needs to exist. It's beneath both of us. Joy's composure slipped further. What had begun as a bold attempt to challenge her guest was now spiraling into a live TV dismantling. She tried again, more desperate this time. Look, Jane, I'm just trying to hold you accountable for your actions. Jane let out a small laugh, not of amusement, but something closer to disbelief. Hold me accountable? Joy, you're a talk show host, not a prosecutor. And even if you were, you'd need accurate information before you made accusations. The tension grew so thick it weighed on the room. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of the unfolding humiliation. Whoopi Goldberg finally stepped in. Maybe we should move on and talk about Jane's new project? But Joy, flushed with embarrassment and refusing to accept defeat, made her biggest mistake yet. No, wait, I think we need to address this properly. Jane, you've made a career out of being controversial. Vietnam, your political stances, stirring the pot has always been your thing. So why are you suddenly so sensitive when someone questions you? The audacity of the remark left everyone stunned. Jane's expression hardened. The irritation was gone, replaced with genuine anger. Sensitive? She said quietly, dangerously. Joy, you clearly don't understand the difference between being controversial and being ignorant. What you just said proves you have no idea what you're talking about. Joy pressed on, emboldened by her own misreading of the moment. I'm talking about your anti-war protests, your comments about American soldiers. You can't rewrite history. The studio froze. Even the crew stopped moving. Jane sat still for a moment, her eyes fixed on Joy. When she finally spoke, her voice was steel. Very well, she said, and the entire studio braced for what would come next. When Jane Fonda finally spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had stared down far more formidable adversaries than a daytime host in the middle of a televised meltdown. Facts, Jane said, her tone steady but lethal. Let me give you some facts, Joy. I spent 2 years visiting wounded veterans in hospitals. I've worked with veteran organizations for more than 50 years. I've apologized repeatedly for any pain my actions caused, and I've spent decades supporting our troops in concrete, meaningful ways. But you wouldn't know any of that, because you didn't bother to research before you opened your mouth. Joy Behar's face had gone pale. She looked like someone who had just realized she'd walked into quicksand, but instead of stopping, she kept struggling and sinking. "Well, that may be true," Joy stammered, "but the perception is still there." "The perception?" Jane's eyebrows rose sharply. "Joy, you're not reporting on perception. You're creating it. You spread misinformation on national television and then hide behind the excuse that it's what people think." The tension had reached a point where even breathing felt intrusive. Sarah Haynes finally found her voice. "Maybe we should take a commercial break?" But Jane lifted her hand, stopping her cold. "No, I think we should finish this conversation. Joy started it. Let's see it through." Joy looked frozen, her eyes wide and unfocused. She'd expected Jane Fonda to be an easy target, an elderly actress she could rattle with aggressive questioning. Instead, she had awakened a force of nature who was now dismantling her credibility piece by piece. "Joy," Jane continued, "you have a platform that reaches millions of people every day. With that platform comes responsibility. You cannot throw around accusations and half-truths simply because you think they make good television." "I wasn't throwing around accusations," Joy protested weakly. "Yes, you were," Jane shot back without hesitation. "From the moment I sat down, you made statements without facts, asked loaded questions, and now you're attempting to rewrite history you clearly don't understand. This isn't journalism, Joy. This is a hit job." All the other hosts looked mortified. Sunny Hostin refused to look up from her hands. Sarah stared blankly at her notes. Whoopi's expression was one of someone frantically calculating how to salvage the show from total collapse. Joy, desperate and drowning, made one more attempt to regain control. "I think you're overreacting, Jane. This is just a normal interview." Jane let out a short, genuine laugh, one that held no amusement, only disbelief. "Normal?" she repeated. "In a normal interview, the host prepares. They research their guest. They ask thoughtful questions designed to inform their audience, and they actually listen to the answers. You've done none of that." "I did prepare," Joy said defensively. "No, you didn't," Jane replied, unflinching. "If you had prepared, you'd know that I've spent the last decade producing climate documentaries, that I've been arrested multiple times for protesting environmental destruction, that I've funded renewable energy projects out of my own pocket. But instead of asking me about any of that meaningful work, you chose to ambush me with tabloid-level gossip." Joy opened and closed her mouth like a fish gasping for air. She had nothing. Jane's accuracy was undeniable. "And another thing," Jane continued, gathering even more momentum, "your approach isn't just unprofessional, it's lazy. You could have led a fascinating conversation about activism, about Hollywood evolving over the decades, about ageism in the industry, about the responsibility public figures carry. Instead, you chose manufactured conflict because you think drama equals ratings." The audience remained utterly silent. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked as though they wished they weren't witnessing the dismantling of a co-host in real time. Joy finally whispered, "I wasn't trying to." "No, Joy," Jane said, settling back into her seat while maintaining a piercing, unwavering gaze. "You were trying to score cheap points at my expense. There's a big difference." Her words fell over the studio like a heavy curtain. Joy Behar seemed to shrink into her chair, deflated, exposed, and utterly defeated, as the cameras continued rolling.
She had walked into the interview convinced she would expose contradictions, challenge narratives, and corner her guest into uncomfortable truths. Instead, she found herself standing in the rubble of her own miscalculation. What she had exposed wasn't hypocrisy, It was her own lack of preparation, her own failure to exercise professionalism, and her own assumption that confrontation alone would carry the moment. Jane Fonda saw all of it, and she wasn't done. Turning back to Joy with a measured calm that carried far more force than anger ever could, she continued the critique she had begun. "The way you've conducted this interview," she said, voice steady and sharp, "says more about you than it does about me. You've shown your viewers that drama matters more to you than meaningful conversation." Joy attempted one last defense, but Jane simply tilted her head, a small, elegant gesture that somehow managed to feel like a reprimand. "Joy," she said, "there's a difference between tough questions and rude behavior. Tough questions are researched, relevant, and respectful. What you've been doing is combative for the sake of being combative." A heavy silence fell across the set. Joy sat still, her face tight with a mixture of shock and humiliation. She had been outmaneuvered, publicly, thoroughly, and with uncanny precision. But Jane wasn't finished. She had spent decades navigating hostile interviews, difficult directors, political heat, and the unpredictable pressure of public life. Compared to all of that, this moment was merely an opportunity, a chance to demonstrate exactly how a seasoned professional handles an interviewer who mistakes aggression for insight. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Joy?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with unmistakable steel. "You had the chance to have a real conversation with someone who has lived through 70 decades of American history. Someone who has witnessed an entire industry evolve, who has stood on the front lines of social movements. And instead, you wasted everyone's time with this performance." Joy's face drained of color. She looked desperately around the table for support, but her co-hosts avoided eye contact. They had silently decided that she had created this disaster, and she could face the fallout alone. "I think we should move on," Joy murmured at last, her earlier bravado nowhere to be found. "Oh, now you want to move on," Jane replied, one eyebrow lifting. "After 10 minutes of accusations and misinformation, now it's convenient for you to change the subject?" The audience was utterly still, captivated. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was a live demonstration of control, composure, and experience. Jane dismantling every tactic Joy had attempted, brick by brick. Leaning forward slightly, Jane asked Joy, "Tell me, Joy, what did you hope to accomplish here? Did you think you'd expose some great hypocrisy? That I would collapse under your questioning? What exactly was your end game?" Joy opened her mouth, but nothing came out. There was simply no defense that wouldn't confirm Jane's point. "Because from where I'm sitting, Joy, it looks like you invited me here not for a conversation, but to use me as a prop for a narrative you'd already prepared. That isn't journalism, Joy. That's exploitation." The word struck like a blow. Joy's hands trembled as she searched for a response. I never intended," but Jane simply raised her hand. "Listen carefully," she said, voice softening in a way that made the words sting even more. "I've faced hostile journalists, aggressive prosecutors, angry protesters, and powerful executives. You are none of those things. You're a talk show host who thought you could score points by being rude to an elderly guest. And that isn't just unprofessional. It's sad." The audience gasped. Joy looked genuinely shaken. Whoopi finally intervened, attempting to rescue her co-host. "Jane, we appreciate you being here. Maybe we should wrap—" But Jane simply lifted a polite hand. "Actually, Whoopi, I'd like to finish this thought," Jane said, lifting a hand gently but firmly. "Joy started this conversation, and I think she deserves to hear my complete response."
Joy's shoulders tensed, as though she hoped she could sink into her chair and vanish, but Jane wasn't offering any escape. Joy, you mentioned earlier that I've been controversial throughout my career, and you're absolutely right. But there's an important difference between being controversial because you're fighting for something you believe in, and being controversial because you don't know how to conduct yourself professionally. Jane paused, letting the distinction linger in the silent studio. When I protested the Vietnam War, when I fought for women's rights, when I stood up for environmental causes, I understood criticism was inevitable. I was prepared for it because my actions had purpose. They meant something. She leaned slightly forward. But what you've done today isn't brave or principled. It's just rude. Rude for no reason other than you thought it would make entertaining television. Joy swallowed hard. I'm sorry if you feel I was rude. Jane didn't miss a beat. I don't feel you were rude, Joy. You were. That's not a matter of interpretation, it's a fact. And your apology would mean a lot more if you understood what you were apologizing for. Across the table, the co-hosts exchanged awkward glances, each silently acknowledging the severity of what was unfolding, but none willing to step between Joy and the storm she had summoned. Let me give you a bit of advice, Jane continued, her tone shifting into something almost academic, like a professor correcting an unprepared student. Next time you have a guest on this show, treat them with respect. Ask questions that inform your audience, not questions designed to create conflict. And most importantly, listen to the answers instead of waiting for your next chance to attack. Joy nodded quickly, hoping cooperation would shorten the ordeal. And remember one more thing, Jane said, her voice gaining quiet power. Your guests are human beings, not punching bags for whatever frustrations you're carrying around. We come on shows like this to share experiences, to talk honestly, to connect. We don't come here to be ambushed by hosts who haven't done their homework. The studio had become so silent that even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed loud. Jane leaned back at last, calm and unwavering, having delivered one of the most precise and devastating on-air corrections daytime TV had ever seen. Joy Behar looked hollowed out, her earlier bravado erased, replaced with a pale, stunned expression. Now, Jane said after a beat, offering a polite but icy smile, would you like to ask me about my actual work, or should I assume this interview is over? Joy darted her eyes around the table, searching desperately for help. She found none. Whoopi stared at her hands. Sunny inspected the ceiling, as though absorbed in its details. Sarah scribbled notes furiously, notes she clearly wasn't reading. I think we should go to commercial, Joy finally whispered. Jane rose with poise, smoothing her blazer. That's probably for the best. Thank you for having me, and I sincerely hope you'll consider what I've said today. As the cameras faded and the lights dimmed, Joy remained seated, looking as though she had been hit by something far larger than an interview segment. She had walked into this conversation expecting to expose Jane Fonda. Instead, she had revealed her own lack of preparation, her unprofessionalism, and her inability to go toe-to-toe with a Hollywood legend who refused to be rattled. The audience filed out in stunned silence, many shaking their heads at the sheer magnitude of what they had just witnessed. It was clear this moment would be remembered as one of the most brutal interview collapses ever aired, and Joy Behar would forever be known as the host who was dismantled, calmly, elegantly, and completely, by an 86-year-old icon who refused to tolerate nonsense.